Welcome back. In part 2, Mriganka discusses two important figures within the Indian Theosophical Society, Peary and Mittra and Mohini Chatterji, how they became on the radar of Blavatsky and Olcott, their differing ideas and perspectives, and how escalating tensions led to a break between Mohini Chatterji and Blavatsky. Mriganka talks in particular about how Indian philosophies such as Advaita Vedanta influenced the Indian perspective and how Indian members approached Theosophy because of it. One of the most important names in the Theosophical movement in India, and you've already mentioned him, Peary and Mittra. As you write, he came to Theosophy via spiritualism, so we've covered that was a very popular movement. Although his first contact with Blavatsky and Olcott was through correspondence, I think you wrote that they had like a correspondence of something like 11 letters before they met each other or before
exactly
a meeting was arranged. Can you talk about how they found out about Mittra and why he was considered to be so important to the establishment of the Theosophical Society in Calcutta? Because he was the first member, correct? If I remember correctly?
Exactly.
Okay.
First Bengali member and the third overall in India. So that's pretty much interesting. So spiritualism is the connecting point. Spiritualism is the Cupid over here. So Mittra, he was a very important figure in Bengal Renaissance. If you look at the history of 19th century Bengal, then Mittra was very well known over there, like as a writer, as a literature. He worked at the public library, the Imperial Library, it was known back then, now known as the National Library. He was the chief librarian over there. And that's how as a librarian, he had access to Western literature. And that's how he came to know about spiritualism for the first time after the death of his wife in 1860. So after the death of his wife, and everything starts romantically. He wants to connect with his dead wife, with the spirit of his dead wife. And what could be the best way to connect with the spirit of his dead wife? Spiritualism. He starts talking, he thinks that he can talk to his wife, very interestingly, and he starts reading about spiritualist texts, and he gets interested to it. He brings his own perspective about Indian religion and starts writing in some of the British or American journals of spiritualism. Banner of Light, for example, one of the leading spiritualist journal. There were a couple of others where Mitra's writings were being published, and he was an excellent writer. Like, he produced a wonderful prose literature in Bangla, in Bengali language. So his writings attract attention, not only because he's an excellent writer, but here comes a non-Western figure who's being interested in spiritualism, writing in spiritualist journals. And I think it was Emma Hardinge Britton, probably, who for the first time informs Blavatsky and Olcott that there is this Indian guy who's very much interested in spiritualism. Maybe we can contact him. So Olcott writes the letter for the first time from New York to Mittra. And straight away, during the first letter, he actually sends off the diploma without even asking like whether Mittra is interested at all or not. He just dispatches the diploma and gives him this title, this designation as a corresponding fellow. Probably Mittra had been interested because as a Bhadralok, as someone who's very much interested in Western ideas, Western education, Western connecting with the Westerners, he becomes interested in it and he joins the movement. And that was very much towards the fag end of his life. So when in 1882, Blavatsky and Olcott arrives in Calcutta for the first time, Mittra was already an old man and he would live just for a year. Like, he would die just a few months after the first anniversary of the Bengal Theosophical Society in 1883. So, but still Mittra becomes the sort of what I call very metaphorically the first foot soldier of occultism in Bengal. So he certainly, that's why he becomes a starting point to the history of occultism, history of Theosophy in Bengal, but not that important if you look at the later history, because there are, of course, like other figures who take over, but certainly as the first man, as a pioneer, he is definitely quite a significant character. And also it shows the connecting points between spiritualism and Theosophy, how spiritualism is functioning as sort of like the background as a launching pad for developing Theosophy in Bengal. And this is also true for other parts of India as well.
If we can talk a little bit more about these ideas about that Mittra had, you write that his ideas about spiritualism and Theosophy were actually different from his Western counterparts. Can you talk more about Mittra's ideas and how they differed?
Mittra, well, of course, he wrote a few things, a few articles and also fictions. I think he is one of those earliest figures who are sort of like bringing in like traditional Indian religion for the first time. So, for example, he writes an article entitled Yoga and Spiritualism. And he thinks that spiritual yoga is the perfect way to connect with the supernatural, with the decreased souls. And so there comes the first connection sort of between yoga and Western esotericism. And as you know, and there have been extensive research on that, how yoga would become a very prominent current in the global history of esotericism. There will be several people who will be talking about it later on. But Mittra was one of those guys who was practicing yoga, and also at the same time he was writing about it and trying to draw a parallel between spiritualism and yoga. This was one of the stories. Another one could be like how Mittra was also talking about the understanding of soul. His understanding of soul was quite Upanishadic, if you will. Like he was sort of bringing out Upanishadic ideas in understanding the nature of spirit, the nature of soul. He writes a book called On the Soul. And all these things are being published either in spiritualist journals or in the Theosophical journal, Theosophist, for example. So the first issue of the Theosophist, which was published in 1879, carried Mitra's article, which shows how important he is in this early phenomena. And there he also talks about the nature of soul, the nature of God. So he raises some very important theological questions, which are sort of being introduced within the fold of Theosophy. All this time, it was Blavatsky who was taking up these theological questions, Indian theological questions, Hindu theological questions, in the pages of in her writings. But here comes an Indian man who's, again, dealing these questions from his own perspective, being a sort of an insider. So here also comes the story of authenticity. And Mittra is not the only one. There will be other people as well in different parts of the country who will be also talking about spiritualism's or Theosophy's connection to Indian traditions and how they viewed their perspective about these subjects.
So in this case, if I understand correctly, Blavatsky was not using any Indian texts as the basis of her writings and teachings, whereas Mittra, if I understood what you were talking about, that he was using the Upanishad as kind of a guideline for his idea about the soul.
Yes and no.
Okay.
Because Blavatsky, if you look at Isis Unveiled, so Isis Unveiled is more inclined towards Egypt, while Secret Doctrine is more inclined towards India. What's happening in these years? Something is changing. Some kind of perspective, change of perception is happening in Blavatsky. What actually happens, Blavatsky here is hiring a lot of Indian collaborators who can read the Indian text, who can read the Sanskrit texts. Because Blavatsky, although she claimed that she knew a lot of languages and her Mahatmas came and wrote texts for her, one has doubts that how much she actually knew Indian languages. And it was basically people like Mohini Chatterji or T. Subbarao or Damodar Mavalankar, who were her early proteges. They were writing these, reading these texts and explaining Blavatsky like what is happening, how Upanishadic views should be understood. So there comes the major change in Blavatsky's writing in the 1880s. As far as Mitra's writing is concerned, of course, Mittra was employing some Upanishadic ideas, but sort of in a lighter way that would become more prominent in Mohini Chatterji's writing, whose basic idea would be Upanishadic thought. So he's sort of like building up his views based on Upanishad. And all the members of Brahmo Samaj are doing the same thing when they are collaborating with the Theosophists. They're sort of like... So there is basically a very fundamental difference between the writings of Blavatsky and the Indian members of the Theosophical Society because of the access of the language, the access of the texts, and also differences in ideas.
Mm. Is there an example that you could give of how these texts differ for those who aren't familiar with the Upanishad writings and not familiar with the ideas associated with those texts?
One good example could be the translation of the Bhagavad Gita, because this book has been translated a number of times by the Theosophists and also non-Theosophists. The first translation of the Bhagavad Gita came from a British Orientalist based in Asiatic Society of Bengal, Charles Wilkins. That was 1785, so still 18th century. But after that, various people would continue translating the Upanishads. The Gita, the Bhagavad Gita. And the first Theosophist who would translate the Bhagavad Gita is Mohini Chatterji. That's 1887. But Mohini Chatterji's Bhagavad Gita would be less known because after Annie Besant publishes her Gita in early 20th century, her version of Bhagavad Gita, known as Lord's Song, that's how she entitled her translation. Mm-hmm. That book will be better known in the theosophical discourses, and everybody would talk about it. So there are some fundamental differences in their understanding of the Bhagavad Gita. While Mohini Chatterji's Bhagavad Gita is more Upanishadic, Annie Besant's Bhagavad Gita carries some Upanishadic ideas, but also at the same time, she brings out something new. And her own understanding of language is also like a bit doubted by many people, like whether she actually really had a good understanding of Sanskrit or not. So that, I think the translation of the Bhagavad Gita is a very, very interesting case study. How Theosophists, the Western Theosophists and Indian Theosophists have been looking at particular text and particular Indian tradition and how they are viewing Hinduism. So that's a very good point, I think.
Okay.
If you think about.
All right. You've already mentioned the name. Another very important name that you write about is Mohini Chatterji, a very influential person within the Theosophical Society in India, but also outside of India. Can you expand on his rise within the society and what led Blavatsky to name him a Chela? Am I pronouncing that correctly? A Chela is a disciple of the Himalayan masters or Mahatmas. Just tell me more about Chatterji.
I was dying for this question. I love talking about Mohini Chatterji. He's my favorite guy. Not only because he was just a very important figure, but also with him, I actually started working on my PhD dissertation.
Okay. Yeah.
So Mohini Chatterji, not much actually known about his early life. Like we know about his family, like which family he comes from. So I mentioned Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who was one of the earliest, actually the founders of the Brahmo ideals. So Mohini is a descendant of Raja Ram Mohan Roy. And at the same time, he got married to the Tagore family. So he is part of the cream de la cream of Bengal. So on one hand, there is the best known intellectual of the Bengal Renaissance, Ram Mohan Roy. On the other hand, there are Tagores. And I remember when I met his great-grandson, who used to teach in Cambridge, I went to interview him. His name is Mohini Chatterji. He told me that two of my ancestors are resting in England. And that's true, like Dwarkanath Tagore, who's one of Mohini's grandfather-in-law. And another is Ram Mohan Roy, who's his great-grandfather. And not many people in Bengal can claim this kind of illustrious family background. This is great. So that's where he comes from. And he himself is a Brahmo, a member of the Brahmo Samaj, a trained lawyer. And he joins the Theosophical Society very early in his life. He was quite young, like early 20s, 23, 24. And actually, it's very interesting. If you look, several of these 19th century, 20th century Theosophists, not only the Indians, but also the Britishers or Americans, you will see many people were actually joining the Theosophical Society very early in their life. The Cateleys in England, for example, or William Quon Judge, or many other Indians were very, very young. William Butler Yeats, who was becoming part of the Hermetic movement in Ireland, his whole entire team was his coterie. They were very young when they were connecting to the Theosophical Society.
Yeah.
So Mohini Chatterji becomes part of that movement, and soon he's promoted as the assistant secretary of the Bengal Lodge, the BTS. And very soon, Olcott appoints him as his own private secretary. So after this, Olcott and Blavatsky tours Europe. That was 1884. And they take Mohini with them. So there's the first time this young lad of 26 comes to first in France, in Paris. And then he also goes to England and settles down in London. And there he stays for a while until Charles Johnston, one of the collaborators of William Butler Yeats and the founder of the Hermetic Society in Dublin, he invites Blavatsky to come and give a lecture in Dublin. Blavatsky says that I'm too busy, and here is my chela, my young disciple, who can take over, and I suggest that you ask him for this lecture. Mohini goes to Dublin, spends a week over there, and profoundly inspires and motivates William Butler Yeats, Charles Johnston, and Russell. So all of them becomes sort of follower of young Mohini. And this is the starting point when poets like Yeats and Russell and Johnston are started to getting interested in India. And they would write a lot about India in their own poetry. Mohini comes back, and there were not much of correspondences between the Irish poets and Mohini in later years. But what happens, Mohini had a difference with Blavatsky. So he goes to America, he goes to Boston, he gives a lecture over there, and then he comes to New York. He stays in New York and Boston for a while, and spends time with some of the Theosophists over there. Arthur Gebhard, for example, one of the well-known American Theosophists at that point. He was a friend of Mohini Chatterji. He hosts him. And in 1887, from Boston, Mohini publishes his Gita. But there were already differences coming up between the Theosophists and Mohini Chatterji. So the Theosophists would never exactly publicize Mohini's version of the Gita. But officially, as this happens, he becomes the first member of the Theosophical Society to actually translate the text for the first time. Anyway, Mohini stays in America for a while, and then he comes back to England once again. Briefly, he visits Rome. There were a lot of discussions, arguments, what he was actually doing in Rome, because he also, there were some rumors he was meeting the Pope, and some thought that he became a Catholic. And Mohini was very much awkward about that. Olcott wrote a letter to his father back in Calcutta that your son is doing these things which we do not sort of support. His father was worried. But anyway, Mohini comes back to India. And in the meantime, there were a lot of scandalous reports happening about Mohini's personal life, that Mohini was like flirting with British and French women, and they were very much interested in him. A lot of juicy reports comes out in the newspapers. But he also gets respected as people are at awe at him. Because here comes an exotic Oriental man, very good looking, very handsome, has a very different kind of fashion, sense of fashion. His hair, his dressing is very important. It's very different. And they find him very interesting. He also bows down at Blavatsky's feet at Charing Cross Station in London, which Blavatsky writes that it makes her uncomfortable, but some says that actually she was happy about it. So this guy also calls Blavatsky a mother, but then falls out with her. But after he comes back to India, he sort of like drifts away from the Theosophical Society, takes up his own path, chooses a different guru, a different preceptor who was a North Indian mystic, becomes his follower, and also continues to participate in Congress annual session, sets up his own law firm, and he would survive until the 1930s, very much would die at an old age. So that was Mohini. Mohini wasn't very much connected to the Theosophical Society all through his life. He was there just for 4 or 5 years. But that was very important when it comes to the global history of the Theosophy. So he was not functioning only in India as an Indian Theosophist, but he was sort of becoming a connecting point between Indian ideas and history of Western esotericism. Mm-hmm. And often there have been writings where Mohini is collaborating with his European and American colleagues. So, for example, there comes this book, Man and His Fragments, there are texts where he's collaborating with Bertram Gately, for example, or Laura Holloway. So there are ideas he's exchanging with them, and he was in touch with some of them. Yeats would, years later in 1930s, would somehow discover that Mohini's son was studying law in London to become a barrister. And Yeats would write a letter to Mohini and would try to send it through his son. And there he would write that, I remember you as a very beautiful, handsome young man who was in his 20s. And I was also in my early 20s, and we collaborated. We had great conversations. And I think, and also some of the people think, that Yeats would later become fond of Rabindranath Tagore as well. In a way, he was actually trying to find Mohini in Tagore. Mm. Because Tagore also dressed sort of in the same way, had the same long hair, looked very exotic by European standards, by colonialist, Orientalist standards. So Mohini was definitely an inspiration and a very motivational figure in the early global history of the Theosophical Society.
like to go back to this falling out that he had with Blavatsky, because I thought this was very interesting with regard to the Mahatmas.
Of course.
For those who may not know, the listeners who may not know, the Mahatmas were purported to communicate through letters, and Blavatsky would claim to receive letters from particular Mahatmas. They all had their own names, and she, if I get anything wrong here, just jump in and correct me. But she claimed to have gotten a letter from one of the Mahatmas that chose Chatterji to be the chela, to be the disciple, and that was her motivation to bring him more to the forefront. Now, as time went on, apparently Chatterji starts to have this very, very peculiar idea about the Mahatmas. Why don't you tell it? Because you know it much better than I do.
Right. So that's very interesting. Like how Chatterji is going back and forth in his ideas. So is Blavatsky, of course.
Yeah.
So what happens, like, initially when Mohini becomes a member, Chatterji becomes a member of the Theosophical Society. Now, I actually consciously try to call Mohini as Mohini, because there is another guy who's called Chatterji in the movement, and his name is J.C. Chatterji. He's also very important, and he translates the Upanishads. So he becomes important in a different way, but he is a bit later figure.
Okay.
And
so we'll refer to Chatterji as Mohini.
Yeah, okay. just to be fair to him, and also to be like following the footsteps of the theosophical texts, particularly as a historian.
Very good.
So Mohini, after becoming a member, Blavatsky goes to Darjeeling, the same Himalayan hill station which I was mentioning early in my talk. And when she goes to Darjeeling, she takes her own entourage with her. And Mohini is part of that entourage, because Mohini has already become a part of Blavatsky's close coterie soon after joining the movement. She almost embraced her like a new godmother. And Blavatsky Mohini actually starts calling Blavatsky as mother in some of his letters. So Mohini goes to Darjeeling, and Mohini claims that he encountered the followers of the Mahatmas, who introduced themselves as Kuthumpa, or the followers of Kuthumi, who's the master, one of the masters. As you rightly mentioned, that masters had different names. So Kuthumi's followers, the master Kuthumi, one of the masters, his followers introduced themselves as Kuthumpa. And Mohini writes about them in one of the issues of the Theosophist. I think this was 1883, December 1883 issue of the Theosophist, where Mohini Chatterji is publishing this article about the descendants, the followers of the Mahatma. So that's where he is subscribing to the Theosophical viewpoint, and he's endorsing Blavatsky's ideas of Mahatma. And he would continue to do so until he's in London, where the Mahatmas would also write about Mohini, that look after him, take care of him. And it's said that these kind of letters started arriving in London, that Mohini is a chela, Mohini is a selected one. We selected him as the special one, and he needs to be looked after. But later on, after Mohini falls out with Blavatsky, very interestingly, Mohini disowns the Mahatmas as well. And he says that, these are the figures, like, if the Mahatmas are so real, then they would never like show themselves up so often. So it's a bit funny how things develop over here. He claims that they are not exactly Mahatmas. They are like a figment of imagination of Blavatsky. And the real Mahatmas doesn't show up like this. They don't write letters so often. So he disowns them. He disowns Theosophy as a whole. But I would say that definitely this is part of his personal fallout with Blavatsky, that how his ideas are changing.
Right.
And also he is still quite young, so it can be also assumed that it's a frivolous mind of a young man who's going back and forth between ideas, whether they are Mahatmas or whether they're not. He was also under pressure to perform in a specific way, to dress in a specific way, to stand or speak in a specific way. Those became a burden on him, I guess. So he became really frustrated after a while. And also within that frustration, disowned the Mahatmas with everything else.
Well, I can understand how Blavatsky would find that type of statement, that the Mahatmas are just a figment of her imagination, that would be threatening to her. However, you did write in one of your texts that it seemed that Blavatsky was accommodating to members who supported her ideas, and yet, oftentimes when people had different ideas or wanted to promote other concepts that might not be what she finds important, then there was this conflict and tension, and then usually there was a falling out. And in regards to Mohini Chatterji, that there was a type of a racial aspect of this tension as well. Can you talk more about that?
Right. That's another important question. And I think this racial aspect would come back again and again. It's not only in the case of Mohini Chatterji, but also it will become relevant when it comes to the relationship between the Indian Theosophists as collective and their Western colleagues. Sometimes in a negative way, sometimes in a more positive Orientalist way, if you can say it like that. What happens in case of Mohini, as I said, was expected to dress in a particular way, to speak or to stand in a particular way. If you look at his pictures, his photographs, the way he's sitting, he's asked to pose in that particular way so that he can give the impression that here comes the exotic Oriental man, the Indian mystic, whom we want to showcase as a poster boy of Theosophy in India. This is how the spiritually advanced Indians look like. This is how the representative of ancient wisdom look like. And we want to showcase that to the Western world. And Mohini was a performer in Blavatsky's hand. In a way, they put him out as a puppet as well, with whose control the ribbons were very much in Blavatsky's own fingertips, and he was being danced in that way. So there is this kind of sense of domination, a kind of a master-servant relationship that's playing out over here, which is still part of colonialist discourse, that here is the boss, Blavatsky, who's a motherly kind of figure, but also imposing herself at the same time. And here is the follower, and the follower should remain a follower. And so here is a follower and the followed. So the priestess should be worshipped, and Blavatsky is the priestess. Mohini plays along for a while, but he gives up after a moment. And this kind of performance pressure is imposed upon Mohini because he is a non-white, a brown representative of the colonial society. And definitely the racial aspect plays out very significantly over here. The racial aspect would play out in a different way in case of Swami Vivekananda as well. When he would be portrayed, he would portray himself. He would definitely contribute himself as well in that creation of that image of the exotic Hindu priest, the Hindu preacher. And he would develop this mass following in the West because of his exotic look as well, the way he dressed up, the way he spoke. So this definitely racial aspect was there. Sometimes it was viewed as in a favorable and positive way. Sometimes also in a negative way, like Mohini was dumped down after a while and also was let down in some ways. But it was not only from the perspectives of Blavatsky or the other Western Theosophists, but also from the perspective of Mohini or some of the Indian Theosophists as well, that they looked upon their Western colleagues as a very different, as a representative of the Western society, definitely, of course, and who came from the same socio-cultural world as did their rulers came from, the Britishers. Mm-hmm. So this is not the Eastern world. They are outsiders, and this was always there in the understanding, in the discourses. And to some extent, this also helped in developing Theosophical Society, its membership, because a lot of people joined the Theosophical Society just because it's led by white Westerners. And Mohini also became a follower of it just because of, in a way, because he found a new priestess in Blavatsky. So this racial aspect is very much there, and it was sensitivized in a different way as well.
Right.
Part of colonialist discourse, very sensitive issue. But we often do not encounter that when we talk about history of esotericism. We might talk about history of esotericism when we talk about it, but more in the history of Orientalism or history of colonialism, this definitely comes out.
Right. That's why I thought it was an important point that you made in the course of your writing to make that observation and to say that this is something that's not really given a lot of attention, and more sensitivity should be given towards these types of situations, these types of relationships that people are having. So I wanted to ask you about it, and thank you for explaining that. Another difference that Mohini Chatterji had that seemed to go against the ideas within the Theosophical Society was that he had, if I'm saying it correctly, he had more of a association or affiliation with the ideas in Vedanta.
Right.
Different philosophy of thinking, and just very generalized. It's the idea that this is an illusion. Our world here is an illusion. And I can understand how this could be quite confrontational to occultist ideas about our world and the things that can happen in our world and the levels of existence in our world. Can you elaborate on this conflict between the philosophy of Vedanta and the more occult leanings of the way the world is supposed to work?
Oh, wow. That would be a bit theological. I don't know whether I should enter very deep into it, because also I might trade into the path of the occultists, how they have the worldview. And of course, I'm not one. As a historian, I would say that, of course, Vedanta, technically, the term means the end of the Vedas, Veda Anta. So Upanishad as a text which is ending the Vedas is also Vedanta. So it's a Vedantic text. As a philosophical category, Vedanta is one of the 6 schools of Indian philosophy. And and there are different strands of Vedanta. One of the strands is Advaita Vedanta, and one of the commentators in the 7th century, Shankaracharya, he actually takes up this idea of Advaita Vedanta. He espouses this strand of idea of Advaita Vedanta, which is very much identified as non-dualistic principle. Mohini takes up Shankaracharya's understanding of Advaita Vedanta. So when we talk about Vedanta, let me be very clear, we are talking about Advaita Vedanta and not other kinds of Vedantas.
Thank you for pointing
as far
that
as
out.
Mohini is concerned.
Yes.
Because there are writings of Blavatsky where she would talk about Vishishta Advaita or the specialized non-dualism, which is a different kind of Vedanta as well. Anyway, when Mohini brings up this issue of Advaita Vedanta, I would say he's one of those earliest figures who's for the first time introducing Advaita Vedanta within the discourses of occultism.
Right.
And you know what, like, there would be many other occultists coming up later on who will also talk about Vedanta or Advaita Vedanta. Some of them not being part of the Theosophical Society. For example, René Guénon, in his early writings, are talking about Vedanta. There are some occasions where Aleister Crowley is talking about Vedanta as well. Definitely, Mohini is the first one who's introducing these concepts within the history of occultism. And then people are picking it up at various points. Not everybody are reading Mohini's writings, but somehow they get integrated. Those thoughts, those concepts, those terminologies get integrated. And some way, these also become very important, very catchy phrases, very attractive terms for the Western Theosophists or the occultists. It helps them to build up a fan base as well in Europe or America. They're introducing something new. The same thing happens about history of cremation as well. When Olcott is taking up cremation for the first time in America, like it becomes a grandiose, like people flocks around, go to see it. Like there is a lot of talk in American press about history of cremation. Same thing is happening in a way, is also happening for any kind of Indian philosophical categories or Indian ideas. That's the Theosophists are picking it up. So Blavatsky is like Mohini is also doing something very catchy with introducing, but in a way he was much more serious than some of his Western colleagues because he knew about those traditions. He knew what he was talking about.
Yeah.
He knew his texts, he knew his traditions, he knew his ideas. What he was doing it very consciously. And we would later see quite naturally, Mohini would collaborate with Swami Vivekananda after he would leave Theosophical Society. And there are moments when Mohini is actually writing very positively about Vivekananda. Vivekananda, on his part, is also echoing Mohini's ideas. So I have also written in my text that Vivekananda, Mohini functions as sort of like precursor to Vivekananda's ideas. Mm-hmm. Vivekananda takes up Mohini's thoughts. And if you study Vivekananda's speech in Chicago, in a way it echoes Mohini's some of the press interviews in Boston. So there are similar kind of ideas which are strikingly similar, very, very much at par with each other. So they are complementing in a way. Mohini is building up that base, building up that platform for Vivekananda in America. So Advaita Vedanta is definitely one of those ideas that Mohini is taking up, and it's becoming a very prominent strand in history of occultism. I would say, like, definitely when you think of the global history of esotericism, the cross-cultural connection between East and West, these are the ideas which should be considered as very important if we need to move beyond the understanding of exclusively Western ideals of esotericism and occultism. And Vedanta is certainly one of those concepts, those philosophical concepts, which Mohini is taking up.
Right.
Or even later Indian Theosophists are also taking up, like Subbarao, for example, in one of the South Indian followers, or Bhagavan Das, one of the followers of Besant, a collaborator of Besant from North India, from Benares. Like they are very prominent intellectuals within the Theosophical Society, but also there's something new to offer.
Right. I thought that was a very interesting point that you made about the Advaita Vedanta, that this was the first time this idea was introduced into occultic historical thought. Thought that was very interesting. Now, although the events that we are discussing here happened in the past, I would ask if the Theosophical Society is still influential in India or in certain areas of India as it had been.
Yes, I would say the Theosophical Society is very much of a living organization. It still has the highest number of members in India. If you look at the global membership, and the annual conventions also take place in Adyar, Chennai, for example, where the international headquarters are located. However, let me mention that what remains of the Theosophical Society today is a mere fossil of the past. So its popularity started rapidly declining in post-independent India. The Theosophical Society still enjoyed some following among the liberal and the socialist politicians until the 1970s. So India became independent in 1947, just to put the context. And like, at least for the next 20, 25 years, there was some following also. For example, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, who was the first female Prime Minister of India, the third Prime Minister as well of the country, was close to Radha Bernier, who was just the former international president of the Theosophical Society, who passed away in 2013. Rukmini Devi Arundel, the famous classical dancer and a leading theosophist, also the wife of George Arundel, who was a former president of the Theosophical Society. Rukmini Devi was given the proposal to become the president of India by the fourth Prime Minister of India, Morarji Desai, in 1977. Or, of course, Rukmini Devi declined that proposal. Or another socialist politician, Achyut Patwardhan, was close to Jiddu Krishnamurti. So there was some sort of nexus between politics and theosophy going on in early post-colonial India. But that strangely declined after the 1980s. There are different factors behind that, why it declined and how it is. And quite interestingly, this connection between theosophy and politics in post-colonial India have not been studied. And I'm doing some research on that right now. So the bottom line is that the organization had some promising existence in the 70s as well, up until 70s, although its popularity started declining only after the death of Mrs. Besant. But its influence was still there, some kind of. But that influence is not there anymore. And not only its political influence has declined, but also its cultural and spiritual significance has greatly dwindled. So, but you will still find its lodges in some of the biggest cities in India, like, for example, in Chennai, where the international headquarters are located. They had a sprawling campus over there. In 2019, I worked there for a month, more than a month. It's a lovely place. It's very, very active, very functioning, very operational. There are also lodges in Mumbai, in Kolkata, or in Varanasi, which is the national headquarters in North India. So perhaps also there are a few members here and there, all throughout the country, who are interested in theosophy. They take part in different kinds of activities. There is something called Theosophical Order of Service, which is very much active. There are youth lodges. And many of these members are involved in alternative spiritual movements. For example, some of them are interested in a movement called pranic healing, which is very prominent in the Lodge of Calcutta or in Mumbai. So they hold sessions over there of pranic healing. Some people are interested in astrology, for example. So they do different kind of stuff. They still read, they still continue holding the study classes, weekly study classes. They have monthly activities happening. There is theosophical federations, the regional federations. The annual sessions also happen, which the theosophists, the Indian members attend from all across the country. So things are happening, but nonetheless, theosophy is not part of the mainstream popular discourse anymore. And yeah, I personally haven't seen people outside the Theosophical Society or the Theosophical movement talking about it, except in the history textbooks, where there are still mentions about Annie Besant or foundation of the Congress Party, Alan Octavian Hume. So it's remembered, but remembered in the popular discourses as a thing of past.
Yeah.
Something on which one should, a student of a school student or a college student of history should memorize for examination purpose, but not out of interest for the movement.
Mm-hmm. And is there still a link between American and European theosophists and Indian theosophists? Is there still collaborations? Of course,
because the Indian headquarters, international headquarters are in India, in Chennai. Mm-hmm. The current president of the International Theosophical Society is Mr. Tim Boyd, who actually is from the United States, but he lives in Adyar. The international vice president or the secretary, I think, is from Finland. So the treasurer is also from America. So, and all these people live in India, live in Chennai. They have nice group. They meet for breakfast and lunch every day. They talk, and there are also like Indian members who join it. There is still an active press running in Adyar. They call it the Vasanta Press. Vasanta, the Indianized version of Besant's name. So Vasanta comes from Besant. So that press is still there. There are theosophical bookshops, for example. Also in Amsterdam, where I am located, there is a theosophical library over here. And the library also has an adjoining bookshop. And there are people who often comes up in the bookshop to look up like text of spirituality and alternative religions. And sometimes you will find a copy of the Bhagavad Gita's translation, a copy of the Upanishads, some writings of Blavatsky, a copy of Secret Doctrine, sometimes the set of old diary leaves of Cornwell Olcott. So these kind of things are happening. But it's still more of a sleepy kind of movement. I don't know if the Theosophists might be a bit angry with me about that, but to be honest, things have declined to great extent what it used to be. Changed. But the collaborations remain between Indian, American, and European members. Also, they have International Theosophical Center in the Netherlands, in Norden, where there are things happening in time and again. People come over there. There are some kind of international activities happening in Singapore as well. So there are collaborations, there are activities.
Very good. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah.
So, of course, we've only been able to touch upon a portion of your work here today, and I very much enjoyed reading your articles and chapters, and I hope that the listeners will also take the opportunity to do that. But you've written much more about your research, and I'd just like to ask where people can follow you if you are on social media, if there are any other places where people can follow your work and read more about what you're doing.
Well, of course, my research is still in progress. Like I'm writing my PhD dissertation, and I'm sort of like trying to finish it up at the moment. So that's still very much in progress. But of course, like you mentioned some of them, and I've also published a few articles and book chapters which are available on the internet. You can find a list of my published pieces on my Google Scholar profile, for example.
Scholar.
You can also read my works on my academia.edu page, which you mentioned earlier. Or if you want to discuss more about my work, like if listeners want to talk about my work and want to connect, you can always contact me via my email address, which is available on my University of Amsterdam profile. I also am active on social media, on Facebook. So I will be happy to respond on all queries. So
wonderful.
Hit me up.
I hope that that the listeners will, because this is a really important aspect that you're doing of your research that you're doing, is giving, as you said earlier, giving a voice to a neglected area in many ways. So I think that what you're doing is really, really important work, and I hope that that you will experience continued success with that work. Good luck with your dissertation, with completing it.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you again for talking with me today. I had a really enjoyable discussion with you about the Indian perspective. And I like that. I like the diversity of perspectives. So I'm glad that we were able to set our date today to talk about it.
Thank you very much. I also thank you for inviting me, and I have listened to some of your podcasts. You're doing an excellent work with rejected religion.
Thank you.
It's a great place, for people who are introducing themselves to history of asceticism to read about it. So I would also request your listeners to subscribe to your YouTube channel to connect with you, and
Thank you so much for the free promotion. You can send me the bill later. No, but it's my pleasure. My pleasure indeed. So thank you again, Mriganka.
Thank you very much.
I hope you've enjoyed this discussion and the special perspective that Mriganka offers in his research. I thought it was something different for the podcast, but also something important to be aware of that can broaden our own perspectives. Please check out the program notes for the links to Mriganka's work, as well as other reference material that is also of interest to this topic. I'd also like to thank the listeners for their interest, their subscriptions, likes, and follows on my social media. If you have the option of rating and reviewing my podcast, I would really appreciate it. And as Mriganka mentioned, new subscribers to my YouTube channel are also welcome and appreciated. I hope to see you next time, and as always, thanks for listening.